All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 32, Section 2, the Domestic Mission. So let's recall last section, 32-1, we're talking about the presidency of George W. Bush. And what was instrumental there was the September 11th attacks, the war on terror, and the invasion of Iraq. Meanwhile, back home, domestically, a couple of things that W. Bush did in his administration was to create tax cuts. This created a wealth gap between, the wealth gap is the difference between rich and poor. We'll just say a wealth gap here, right? This will illustrate the wealth gap, which was in part a consequence of tax cuts. But also some of his domestic policies included reforms to education. There was a fear, especially in the 2000s, that American students were falling behind their counterparts around the world. No Child Left Behind made testing in, I believe, high schools to ensure a minimum education. This was a federal policy on education, which wasn't very common for Republicans. George W. Bush was a Republican, but this was supported. And increased funding and support for charter schools. A charter school is a school that takes both public, which is typically what most public schools are, they take public funding from taxes, but also allowed to take private money as well. And this was seen as perhaps an alternative to the public school system, which many believed at the time was failing the younger generation of Americans. In the 2004 election, George W. Bush ran against John Kerry. He was the Democratic candidate for president. Here you can see John Kerry right here. And this was coming at a time when the 2003 Iraq invasion still had some support among Americans. However, as the months dragged on and as the years dragged on and as this became more and more of an occupation, right, that lasted much longer than the initial victory that was claimed by George W. Bush early on in the conflict, more Americans began to turn on the war in Iraq and turn on George W. Bush himself. It wasn't enough. In 2004, George W. Bush was reelected. Is reelected. John Kerry loses. But some of the things that Americans began really kind of turning on this conflict included, of course, the whole reason why the war started, weapons of mass destruction, where were they to be found? The controversy over Abu Ghraib. This was a prison where prisoners were humiliated. Some very some very disturbing photos were released of U.S. forces dressing up prisoners, humiliating them, degrading them, and those photos were released, which really reflected bad on the United States and on the U.S. occupation. Fallujah was the site of an ambush on U.S. forces. A number of U.S. forces were killed in Fallujah, and their bodies were dragged through the streets, televised on, and watched by people around the world. You had the constant threat or constant attacks of various ambushes that were taking place against U.S. forces there. And two of the major demographic groups, the Shia and the Sunni, so these are two, what you might call sects. All right, a sect is like a smaller subgroup of Muslims who fought for control. Iraq. That in the aftermath of U.S. occupation, in the aftermath of toppling Saddam Hussein, in trying to rebuild Iraq into a country that was more like the United States, what the U.S. found was, not only a long and bloody occupation. But two of the major demographic groups there, the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims, essentially didn't agree on a lot of things. And so trying to rebuild it proved ever elusive. And eventually, it is this war in Iraq that turned, a lot of Americans end up turning on George W. Bush for that war. The war in Afghanistan was more popular because there was a much closer connection between Afghanistan, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and the September 11th attacks. The connection between Iraq and September 11th was not as clear-cut as it was in the case of Afghanistan. Domestically, George W. Bush doesn't get a lot done, a failed domestic agenda. One example is George W. Bush fails to privatize Social Security, right? Recall that Social Security was a program dating all the way back to FDR and the New Deal. It provides welfare for Americans over a certain age, including other groups. And by the time you got to the 2000s, what had happened in the US was there's a big demographic shift. A lot of the baby boom generation were about to reach their retirement years, and there wasn't essentially enough young people to pay for all the retirees. And so one of the solutions for that, at least for the Bush administration, was to turn Social Security, instead of a government program, turn into like a private program where people can save money themselves rather than having Social Security exist as it did before. That failed, right? That failed to pass. And the domestic response, which George W. Bush was probably the most criticized for, was Hurricane Katrina, which hit, among other southern or southeastern cities, New Orleans. This was massive flooding. In fact, you can see the picture right here, right? Most of New Orleans was underwater. People were killed. We could say, the death toll was, I think, I'd have to check the book, but maybe 1,500 people were killed in Hurricane Katrina. And so as a result of that, Bush's popularity also decreased. So it was Katrina plus Iraq, which really turned a lot of Americans against the Bush administration. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, received criticism for its poor preparation and response to Katrina. And this opposition, Iraq plus Katrina, manifested in congressional elections that led Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, to become the first woman Speaker of the House. And again, her election was mostly in opposition to Bush, right? To Bush. Underneath the surface, the American economy was in some serious trouble, or at least there was some serious trouble on the horizon. The case of Enron was an energy company which was engaged in fraud, massive fraud taking place, which resulted in the CEOs of Enron being sentenced to quite long prison terms. What happened to Enron was one of the most valuable companies in the United States. It turned out to be all a fraud, and this really revealed or showed the weakness in the U.S. economy, at least what was to come, which is the Great Recession of 2008. The Great Recession is the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. So the Enron fiasco, right, where the CEOs went to jail for fraud, that's happening in the early 2000s. But the cause of the Great Recession, and this gets a little bit complicated, so don't technically have to try to follow every step here, but it's very heavily put on home mortgages. So I'm going to attempt to try and explain this here, right? So we have homes, right? And if you're not familiar, a mortgage is a loan to buy a house, right? That's what a mortgage is here. You have a person. You also have a bank, right? The banks are the ones who provide the loans. And then you have investors, right? We'll put a top hat on him because he's an investor, a monocle, and a cane, right? And so essentially what led to the Great Recession was, on the one hand, well, there's multiple parts, but first of all, subprime mortgages. So as a buyer of homes, you go to the bank in order to take out a mortgage so you could buy a house. And so money is going in this direction. A lot of these banks were giving out subprime mortgages or high risk mortgages. In other words, money was being lent. So this is a high risk loan. Money was being lent essentially to people who really couldn't afford to buy the house to begin with, and the bank shouldn't have been loaning the money either, sometimes called predatory lending, looking for people and locking them into certain home mortgages. That money that then went to, the loans that then went to home buyers, of course, they pay it back in the form of a mortgage payment. So whenever you pay a mortgage payment, you pay an interest rate. So let's say you borrow $3 signs, you will eventually pay back $4 signs. You have to pay back the principal plus whatever the interest is, but over time. And historically, mortgages are about one of the safest, right? Historically, one of the safest ways that banks can make money, because people generally pay their bill for their houses. However, because there was such a desperation, you might say, by banks, or greed is probably a better word, greed by banks to take out these loans, or to give out these loans, I should say. A lot of these mortgages were, again, subprime. They were not really, and they should not have been made in the first place. When the bank receives that money, when it receives that $4 signs, it then gives it to investors, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Investors, of course, then hope that that money will go up, or, you know, in any other way that the bank wants to invest it. They're going to put that money into the stock market. You know, they're going to take that money and buy other assets, right? I mean, they might even invest it into another bank or whatever that is, right? And hopefully that money will grow. These investments right here, actually, no, let's go right here, are called CDOs, right? Collateralized debt obligation. And essentially what investors did is they received multiple, right, mortgages from multiple banks, right, all bundled up in this CDO. Now, the idea was that, you know, this money right here was essentially there because these people could pay back their mortgages. Credit default swaps were insurance on investments, right? So let's call CDOs. These are a bundle of investments, right? So you bundle up all the subprime mortgages into a CDO. Let's say that you have 10 mortgages. Each mortgage is worth $100,000. Your CDO then becomes $1 million. And because historically mortgages had been safe, that $1 million is about the safest investment you can make. And to make matters worse, you can insure it with a credit default swap, which means you can be very reckless in terms of where you end up investing that money. As you can see, this whole system of investments in banks and loans and mortgages are built on a very shaky ground. And that is, of course, what happens when people no longer have the ability to pay their home mortgages. And that essentially is where the Great Recession begins to unfold. When the Great Recession began to unfold, banks like Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Lehman Brothers was a bank that had been over 100 years in business, went bankrupt. Congress responded with the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, which gave money to banks. to bail out. And in some ways, you know, the years 2008, 9, 2010, 2011, 2012 were very bad economically speaking. There has been a recovery since then, but it's really too early to tell the full impact of the Great Recession. In many ways, even in 2020, we're still living with some of the consequences of it.